October 2019. 3 months after the divorce papers were signed, I found myself driving north through the Adirondacks toward a place I'd never seen, but somehow felt I owed a visit. My father Vernon's cabin sat somewhere deep in the White Pine Forest, 3 miles beyond what used to be Millbrook Falls, a logging town that died with the mill closure in 1987. Dad had built that cabin with his own hands back when he worked as a supervisor at the lumber mill. After the corporate buyout forced everyone out, he'd moved down to Albany and never spoke about the old place again. Hell, he barely spoke about anything from those days. When he passed last spring, I'd found the property deed tucked away in his papers, along with some faded photos of him and his mill crew standing beside massive pine logs. The guilt had been eating at me since the funeral. We'd grown apart over the years, my insurance work keeping me traveling, his stubborn pride keeping him distant. I'd missed too many calls, skipped too many visits. Now, with my marriage falling apart and too much time on my hands, restoring his cabin felt like the least I could do. The drive took longer than expected. My GPS lost signal once I turned off Route 28, leaving me to navigate by the hand-drawn map I'd found with the deed. The October foliage was spectacular, but disorienting. Every turn looked the same through the maze of red maples and golden birches. When I finally reached Millbrook Falls, the sight stopped me cold. The main street stretched maybe 2 blocks, lined with hollow buildings that stared back with broken windows and sagging roofs. The old lumber mill dominated the far end like a sleeping giant, its smokestacks reaching into the gray sky like accusations. I parked behind what used to be Thorne's Gas and General Store, figuring it would hide my Toyota from any curious eyes. According to Dad's map, the trail to his cabin started just past the mill's loading docks. The path was barely visible, overgrown with brambles and fallen branches. I shouldered my pack, loaded with camping gear, tools, and enough supplies for 3 days, and started the 2-mile trek through the forest. The canopy was thick enough to make it feel like dusk, even though it was only mid-afternoon. When I finally reached the clearing, I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. The cabin was still standing, but just barely. It was a simple rectangular structure, maybe 20 by 30 feet, built from the local pine that Dad had known so well. Vines climbed the walls like grasping fingers, and the porch sagged under the weight of fallen branches. The front door hung open on rusted hinges. No locks, just like Dad always said. Nothing worth stealing way out here. Inside, the single room reeked of mildew and decay. Trash was scattered across the plank floor, empty beer bottles, cigarette butts, a moldy sleeping bag in one corner. Someone had definitely used this place as a crash pad, though it looked like they'd been gone for years. I spent the remaining daylight clearing out the debris and making a flat space for my sleeping bag near the old stone fireplace. The chimney drew well enough once I got a fire going, filling the cabin with welcome warmth as darkness crept through the trees. That first night was rough. I'd wake every 30 minutes with an inexplicable sense of unease, like something was watching from the forest beyond the windows. The feeling was so strong, I actually got up twice to check the door, making sure it was securely latched. Each time, I found nothing but darkness and the normal sounds of the woods, owls calling, branches creaking in the wind. Dawn came as a relief. I fired up my camp stove for coffee and decided to explore the area before starting work on the cabin. A game trail led uphill through the pines, and after 20 minutes of climbing, I reached a rocky outcrop that offered a view back toward Millbrook Falls. The abandoned town looked even more desolate from this distance, a cluster of dark shapes against the morning mist. But as I watched, something caught my attention. A light in one of the buildings. Just a brief flicker, like a flashlight or lantern being switched on and off. It was too far to tell which building, but someone was definitely down there. My first thought was my car. I'd hidden it well, but if someone was poking around the old town, they might spot it. More likely, though, it was just another urban explorer, or maybe some kids from the nearest real town, checking out the ruins. The Adirondacks drew plenty of curiosity seekers, especially this time of year. I sat on the rocks for another hour, watching the sun burn off the mist while I tried to shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. The light didn't reappear, but I made a mental note to keep an eye on things. Dad had always said trust your instincts, especially in the woods. Back at the cabin, I spent the day clearing brush and checking the foundation stones. The structure was solid. Dad had built it right. But the roof needed work, and several wall logs had started to rot where moisture had gotten in. I had my hands full, but it was good work, the kind that cleared your head and tired your body in a satisfying way. As evening approached, I got the fireplace going again and settled in with a can of beans and some whiskey I'd brought to toast Dad's memory. The flames danced and crackled, filling the cabin with shifting shadows that seemed almost alive in the corners of my vision. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, I told myself it was just the settling sounds of the old cabin, or maybe a deer moving through the underbrush. But as I sat perfectly still, listening over the crackle of the fire, the rhythm became unmistakable. Deliberate footsteps circling the cabin, slow and careful, like someone trying not to be heard. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for the hunting knife I'd packed with my tools. The footsteps stopped, directly in front of the door. In the sudden silence, even the fire seemed to roar like a freight train. Then came the knock, 3 measured raps on the weathered wood. "Vernon?" a gravelly voice called out. "Vernon Whitmore? That you in there, old friend?" The sound of my father's name froze me to the bone. How could anyone out here know Dad? He'd been gone from this place for over 30 years. "Who's there?" I managed to call back, my voice steadier than I felt. A pause. Then, "Name's Zeke Drummond. Used to work with your daddy at the mill. Saw the smoke from your fire and figured, well, hell, I was hoping it might be old Vern come back to visit." Zeke Drummond. I tried to place the name from Dad's stories, but he'd shared so little about his mill days. Still, the man knew the family name, knew about the cabin. Maybe he really was one of Dad's old crew. "My father passed away this spring," I said, moving closer to the door, but not opening it. "I'm his son, Aldrich." Another long pause. When the voice came back, it carried a note of what might have been genuine sadness. "Sorry to hear that, son. Vernon was a good man, one of the best supervisors we ever had at Millbrook. Been hoping to see him again for, must be 30 years now." The words sounded right, but something in the delivery made my skin crawl. There was an eagerness underneath the grief, like a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. "How about you open up so we can talk proper?" Drummond continued. "Gets mighty cold out here in October. Your daddy wouldn't want you leaving an old friend to freeze." I pressed my back against the rough log wall, knife handle slick with sweat in my palm. Every instinct Dad had taught me about the woods was screaming danger, but I couldn't pinpoint why. The man hadn't said anything threatening. Knew Dad's name, claimed to be a friend. "It's pretty late," I said carefully. "Maybe we could talk in the morning." The temperature in the voice dropped 20 degrees. "Now that ain't very neighborly, is it? I walked 3 miles through these woods just to pay respects to Vernon's memory." "How did you know I was here?" "Saw your car back in town. Put 2 and 2 together when I spotted the smoke. Figured it had to be family, coming back to the old place." That made sense, but it also meant he'd been watching, following. The light I'd seen from the overlook that morning, had that been him? "Listen, Mr. Drummond," I said, "I appreciate you wanting to share memories of my father, but, boy," the word cut through my explanation like a blade. "You gonna make me stand out here all night? That what Vernon taught you about treating folks?" The false friendliness was gone now, replaced by something that made the hair on my neck stand up. Through the gap under the door, I could see his shadow shifting, restless. "Open this door, Aldrich." He knew my full name now, though I'd only given him Al. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I backed away from the door, grabbing my flashlight and pack. The cabin suddenly felt like a trap. One room, one way out. And whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't here to reminisce about lumber mill days. "Your daddy never told you about what really happened here, did he?" Drummond's voice had taken on a sing-song quality that raised every alarm in my head. "About why we all had to leave so sudden-like? About what we found in the deep woods that last winter?" I didn't answer. I was too busy checking the windows, looking for another way out. They were all too small, too high off the ground. "Some things got stirred up when they started clear-cutting them old growth pines," he continued, almost conversational now. "Things that should have stayed buried. But Vernon, he knew how to keep secrets, didn't he? Even from his own boy." The door handle rattled. Then the hinges creaked as pressure was applied from outside. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to come back to this place," Drummond said, his voice closer now, like his mouth was pressed against the crack in the door. 32 years I've been keeping watch, making sure nobody disturbed what's sleeping in these woods. But family? Well, family's got a right to know the truth. The door shuddered as something heavy hit it. The old latch held, but barely. I killed my flashlight and moved to the back corner of the cabin, crouching behind Dad's old workbench. Through the window, I could see a shape moving around the cabin's perimeter, tall, gaunt, wearing what looked like the rotted remains of work clothes. "You can't hide forever, boy." The voice was different now, younger somehow, like multiple people speaking at once. "Your daddy's debt comes due. The pines remember. The mill remembers." Another crash against the door. Wood splintered. That's when I smelled it, the thick, cloying scent of pine sap mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of the mill photos, of rusted machinery and old blood. And in that moment, I finally understood why Dad had never brought me here. Why he'd never spoken of Millbrook Falls or the men he'd worked with. Some secrets were meant to stay buried in the deep woods. The door gave way with a sound like breaking bones. The October wind cut through the Pocono Mountains like a blade, sending amber leaves spiraling down onto the gravel road leading to our cabin. My brother Sterling had found this place through a construction buddy, a weathered 2-bedroom tucked deep in the Pennsylvania wilderness, far enough from civilization that your cell phone became a paperweight. "Perfect for getting our heads straight," Sterling had said when he pitched the Columbus Day weekend trip. At 37, my older brother still carried himself like the high school linebacker he'd been, broad shoulders permanently set in a protective stance. As a construction foreman, he spent his days managing crews and solving problems. This was supposed to be his escape. I'd agreed readily enough. Working as an insurance adjuster in the Philadelphia suburbs had been grinding me down. Endless claims, suspicious clients, and the constant weight of other people's disasters. At 34, I felt older than my years, and the promise of 3 days without ringing phones or damage assessments seemed like salvation. The cabin sat in a natural depression between 2 ridges, surrounded by towering oaks and maples that filtered the afternoon light into dancing shadows. It was the kind of place that looked picturesque in daylight, but would feel completely isolated once darkness fell. We spent the first day settling in, unpacking our gear and getting our bearings. Sterling had brought his usual overpacked cooler and enough camping equipment to survive a month. I'd kept it simple, just clothes, a good book, and my hiking boots. The plan was straightforward: disconnect, recharge, and maybe get in some decent hiking before winter locked down the mountains. Around 5:30 that first evening, with the sun already dropping behind the western ridge, Sterling announced he was going for a walk to scout tomorrow's hiking route. "Don't go too far," I called from the couch, where I'd been half dozing by the stone fireplace. "Getting dark early these days," he waved me off with typical big brother confidence. "Just want to check out that trail marker we saw on the drive-in. Be back in an hour." I watched him disappear into the tree line, noting he hadn't bothered with a flashlight or day pack. Classic Sterling, always confident the world would bend to his schedule. I settled back into the couch, letting the fire's warmth wash over me as exhaustion from the 5-hour drive finally caught up. The cabin grew steadily darker as the sun vanished behind the mountains. What started as golden twilight faded to deep purple, then to the kind of black that only exists far from city lights. The fire provided the only illumination, casting writhing shadows on the knotty pine walls. That's when I realized Sterling should have been back an hour ago. I grabbed my headlamp and a heavy flashlight from our gear pile, along with my day pack. The October air bit at my face as I stepped outside, and I could hear my breath in the sudden silence. No traffic, no neighbors, no distant hum of civilization, just the whisper of wind through dying leaves. The trail Sterling had mentioned started about 50 yards behind the cabin, marked by a weathered wooden post. I followed it into the woods, calling his name every few minutes and sweeping my flashlight beam across the forest floor. My voice seemed to die just a few feet from my mouth, swallowed by the dense canopy above. 10 minutes in, I started feeling watched. It began as a prickle between my shoulder blades, the kind of sensation that makes you glance over your shoulder. I told myself it was just the woods playing tricks. Every shadow could hide a bear. Every rustling branch might mask approaching danger. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step. I just stopped to call Sterling's name again when I saw movement ahead. A figure emerged from the darkness, walking quickly down the trail toward me. The relief was immediate, until I got close enough to see Sterling's face in my flashlight beam. He looked rattled, not panicked, exactly, but moving with the controlled urgency of someone trying not to run. "Thank God," I started to say, but he cut me off. "We need to go back, now." His voice carried an edge I'd rarely heard, even during his worst days managing difficult job sites. "What happened? You look like you've seen a—" "Just turn around, Elias. We'll talk at the cabin." We walked back in tense silence, Sterling occasionally glancing over his shoulder. Only when we were safely inside with the door locked did he finally explain. "Someone was watching me," he said, settling heavily into the chair across from the fireplace. "About half a mile up the trail, I got that feeling you get when someone's staring. Looked around and saw this guy maybe 50 yards off in the trees." "Another hiker?" Sterling shook his head. "Wrong clothes, wrong time of day, and the way he was standing, perfectly still, just watching. When I started walking back, he moved parallel to the trail, keeping pace, like he was following. I felt that familiar protective instinct kick in, the same one that had gotten me into fights defending Sterling when we were kids, despite him being bigger and stronger." "What did he look like?" "Hard to tell in the shadows, but something was off about him. Clothes looked torn up, and he had this long, greasy hair. But it was the way he moved. Too quiet, too deliberate. Like he'd been doing this for a while. We tried to rationalize it over dinner. Maybe the guy had a cabin nearby, or was camping illegally. Maybe he was just as startled to see Sterling as Sterling was to see him, but neither of us really believed it. As night deepened around us, we built up the fire and moved our conversation to the front porch, ostensibly to enjoy the mountain air. In reality, we were both scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The darkness beyond our small circle of porch light seemed absolute, pregnant, with possibility. We talked about everything except what we were really thinking, that somewhere out there in the black woods, someone might be watching our every move. We stayed up later than planned, feeding the fire and making small talk that fooled neither of us. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made us pause mid-sentence, straining to listen. When we finally went inside around midnight, Sterling made a show of checking the door locks twice. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, washing away some of the previous night's unease. We made coffee and planned our hike to Eagles Peak, the highest point in the area. Sterling seemed more like himself, joking about my tendency to overpack trail snacks. "Probably just some old hermit living off-grid," he said as we shouldered our packs. "Half these mountains are full of guys who dropped out of society decades ago." The 6-hour hike proved spectacular. Autumn colors blazing across the mountainsides, views stretching to distant ridges. The kind of wilderness experience that reminds you why you escaped the city. By the time we returned to the cabin that afternoon, we were exhausted but satisfied, the previous day's encounter feeling like a minor footnote. Sterling dropped his pack by the door and stretched his back. "I'm claiming a first shower. That last mile about killed me." I collapsed onto the couch, too tired to argue. "Just save me some hot water." He disappeared down the short hallway toward the bathroom, and I heard the familiar creak of the bedroom door. The cabin fell into that peaceful quiet that follows a good day outdoors, just the settling of old wood and the distant whisper of wind. Then, without warning, that uneasy feeling from the night before came flooding back. I sat up, suddenly alert. Something felt wrong, though I couldn't identify what. The silence seemed too complete. I glanced toward the hallway, expecting to hear the rumble of the old water pump kicking in for Sterling's shower. Nothing. "Sterling?" I called out. No response. I got up and walked down the narrow hallway, my boots loud on the worn wooden floors. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar, exactly as Sterling had left it, but there was still no sound of running water. "Hey, you fall asleep in there?" I knocked on the door, pushing it open a few inches. "What I saw through that crack will haunt me for the rest of my life." Sterling knelt in the far corner of the room, his back to the door, perfectly motionless. His eyes were wide with terror, fixed on mine with an intensity that made my blood freeze. He was shaking his head almost imperceptibly, a tiny, desperate motion that screamed one word: run. I pushed the door open fully and saw why. A man stood just a few feet from my brother, and everything about him radiated wrongness. His clothes hung in tatters, stained with things I didn't want to identify. Greasy black hair fell past his shoulders, framing a face that looked like it hadn't seen soap or civilization in years. But it was his eyes that stopped my heart, wide and wild, with the vacant stare of someone who'd crossed a line most people never even approach. In his right hand, held loosely at his side, was a revolver. Time compressed into a single crystalline moment where every detail burned itself into my memory. The drifter's cracked lips moving soundlessly, Sterling's desperate expression, the smell of unwashed human, and something worse that I couldn't place. Then instinct took over. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just moved. I charged across that room like my life depended on it, which it did. The drifter's head snapped toward me, eyes widening with surprise, and I saw his gun hand starting to rise. But I was already committed, already flying through the air in a tackle that would either save us or get us both killed. We went down hard, crashing into the wall with enough force to rattle the entire cabin. The gun flew from his grip, skittering across the floor. Sterling immediately understood, diving for the weapon while I wrestled with what felt less like a man than a wild animal. The drifter fought with inhuman desperation, clawing and biting, and making sounds I'd never heard from a human throat. His fingernails, black with filth, raked across my arms as he tried to break free. The smell coming off him was nauseating. Unwashed flesh mixed with something rotting. "Got it!" Sterling shouted, securing the revolver. But our prisoner wasn't finished. He writhed and bucked beneath me, screaming in a voice gone raw from disuse. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. Whatever had broken in this man's mind had broken completely. "Jesus Christ," Sterling breathed, keeping the gun trained on our captive. "What the hell is wrong with him?" We managed to bind him with extension cords and rope from our gear, though it took both of us to keep him still long enough. Even restrained, he kept struggling, making those horrible animal sounds. "We need to get out of here," I said, breathing hard. "Now." Sterling nodded, his face pale but determined. "I'll load the car. You watch him." We threw our belongings into the trunk with record speed, adrenaline making us efficient despite our shaking hands. The drifter's screams followed us out of the cabin and into the night, a sound that seemed to make the darkness itself recoil. As we drove away, our headlights cutting through the mountain blackness, we could still hear him howling behind us. Cell service finally returned 20 miles down the mountain, and we called 911 immediately. But when the state police reached the cabin 3 hours later, they found only torn restraints scattered across the bedroom floor and no sign of our attacker. The gun, however, told a story. It was registered to Cornelius Ashford, a local man who'd vanished without a trace 5 years earlier. Based on our description of the drifter, the police believed we'd encountered whoever had taken Ashford's life and his weapon. We drove home in stunned silence, both understanding how close we'd come to joining Cornelius Ashford among the missing. Sometimes I still wake up seeing those wild eyes, wondering if somewhere in the Pocono Mountains, something that was once human is still prowling the trails, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to stumble into his hunting ground. The mountains are beautiful in October, but beauty can hide monsters, and some wildernesses are wild for reasons that have nothing to do with nature. This happened back in October 2018, when I was going through the worst period of my life. I'm Darius Holcomb, 42 years old, and I just finalized a brutal divorce that cost me half of everything I'd worked for. My job as regional sales director was grinding me down, and I desperately needed to get away from the constant reminders of my failed marriage scattered throughout our suburban Minneapolis home. That's when my older brother Barnabas called with an offer. He owned a hunting lodge up in the remote Montana wilderness, about 45 minutes from the nearest town of Glacier Falls. The place had been in our family for 3 generations, originally built by our grandfather as a timber operation headquarters back in the 1940s. Barney had modernized it over the years, turning it into a comfortable retreat for his hunting clients, but October was off-season. He offered to let me stay there for a couple weeks, completely alone, to clear my head. I jumped at the chance. After loading my SUV with enough supplies for 2 weeks, I made the long drive from Minneapolis to Montana. The lodge sat on 80 acres of dense forest, surrounded by towering pines and connected to civilization by a single gravel road that wound through the mountains. When I first laid eyes on the place, I was impressed. This wasn't some rustic cabin. It was a proper 2-story lodge with modern amenities, a stone fireplace, and large windows offering spectacular views of the surrounding wilderness. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and cell phone reception was spotty at best, perfect for what I needed. I spent the first day settling in, unpacking my things, and familiarizing myself with the property. Barney had left detailed instructions about the generator, the water pump, and the security system. The place felt like a fortress against the world, exactly what my battered psyche required. It was on the second evening, around dusk, when I first noticed something was wrong. I was carrying firewood from the storage shed to the main lodge when I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. About 200 yards out at the edge of the tree line, I saw a figure standing motionless among the pines. The person was too far away for me to make out any details, but they were definitely watching me. In my 15 years working corporate security consultations, I developed good instincts about being observed, and every alarm bell in my head was ringing. I set down the firewood and stared back, trying to get a better look. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge my attention in any way. They just stood there, a dark silhouette against the darkening forest. After about 30 seconds, I decided to walk toward them, but the moment I took a step in their direction, the figure melted back into the trees and disappeared. I stood there for several minutes, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing more. Maybe it was a hunter, I told myself. Maybe someone had gotten lost and was trying to figure out where they were. This was Montana, after all. People hunted these woods regularly during season. But hunting season didn't start for another 3 weeks. I finished bringing in the firewood and locked the door behind me, something I hadn't bothered to do the night before. Before going to bed, I sent Barney a text message asking if he knew of anyone who might be in the area. His response came an hour later. Nobody should be out there. Property is posted and gated. Probably just a lost hiker. That explanation didn't sit right with me, but I tried to push it out of my mind. The next morning brought an early snow, the first of the season. Fat flakes fell steadily, creating a pristine white blanket over the property and muffling all sound from the outside world. I spent most of the day inside, reading and trying to process the emotional wreckage of my divorce. Every so often, I'd look out the windows, but the falling snow limited visibility to maybe 50 yards. As evening approached, I built a fire and settled in with a whiskey, finally feeling some of the tension leave my shoulders. The crackling flames and the soft patter of snow against the windows created a hypnotic atmosphere that was exactly what I'd been hoping for. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the settling logs in the fireplace. Soft crunching sounds in the snow circling the lodge. I muted the television and listened intently. The footsteps were deliberate, methodical, making a slow circuit around the building. Someone was out there, walking the perimeter of the lodge in the darkness. My blood ran cold as I realized the implications. This wasn't a lost hiker or a confused hunter. Someone was conducting surveillance on the property, and they were doing it under cover of darkness and falling snow. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crept to the front window, staying low and peering out through a gap in the curtains. The beam cut through the swirling snow, but I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps had stopped. Then I heard them again, closer this time, right outside the side door that led to the kitchen. The footsteps stopped directly outside the kitchen door. I could hear my heart hammering in my chest as I crept through the darkened lodge, flashlight in one hand, my cell phone in the other. The phone showed no signal. The storm had knocked out what little reception existed up here. I pressed my ear to the kitchen door and listened. Nothing but wind and the soft hiss of falling snow. Then after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps resumed, moving away from the door and continuing around the building. Whoever was out there was taking their time, studying the lodge, looking for something, looking for a way in. I checked every door and window, making sure everything was locked tight. The lodge had good security, solid deadbolts, reinforced frames, and storm, shutters that could be closed from the inside. Barney had always been paranoid about break-ins at remote properties. Tonight I was grateful for his caution. The footsteps completed their circuit and stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. I knew the person was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, but I had no idea where or what they were planning. I tried calling Barney on the landline, but the storm had knocked out phone service too. I was completely cut off, 80 acres from civilization, with someone stalking me in the night. Moving to the main room, I positioned myself where I could see both the front and back approaches to the lodge. The The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, making every movement seem menacing. I sat there for 2 hours, flashlight ready, listening for any sound that didn't belong. Around midnight, I heard glass breaking. The sound came from upstairs, a sharp crack followed by the tinkle of falling shards. Someone had broken one of the second-floor windows. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and crept toward the stairs, every muscle in my body coiled with tension. The old wooden steps creaked under my weight as I climbed, flashlight beam dancing ahead of me. At the top of the stairs, I could see snow blowing through the broken window of the guest bedroom, and my blood turned to ice. If someone had climbed up to the second floor, they were already inside the lodge. I swept the flashlight around the room, but it appeared empty. The window had been broken from the outside. Glass scattered across the hardwood floor, curtains whipping in the wind, but there were wet footprints leading from the window to the hallway. Someone was in the lodge with me. I backed toward the stairs, poker raised, when I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I spun around and my flashlight beam illuminated a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was a man, maybe 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing and a knit cap pulled low over his face. In the harsh glare of the flashlight, his eyes reflected like an animal's. We stared at each other for a heartbeat that felt like an hour. Then the man took a step toward me, and I saw something glint in his hand. A knife. "Get out of my house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Get out now." The man didn't respond. He took another step forward, moving with the patient confidence of a predator who knew his prey was trapped. I threw the flashlight at him and bolted for the stairs. Behind me, I heard him curse as the light struck him, then the sound of heavy boots pursuing me. I took the steps 3 at a time, poker still clutched in my hand, adrenaline overriding 42 years of accumulated aches and pains. The front door seemed miles away as I sprinted across the main room. I could hear him on the stairs behind me, moving fast. My hand shook as I fumbled with the deadbolt, precious seconds ticking away. The lock finally turned, and I burst out into the storm. The snow was falling harder now, wind whipping it into horizontal sheets that stung my face and limited visibility to just a few feet. I ran toward my SUV, parked 50 yards from the lodge, my socks soaking through immediately in the deep snow. Behind me, I heard the front door slam open. I reached the vehicle and yanked on the handle. Locked. My keys were still inside the lodge, hanging on the hook by the kitchen door. Panic threatened to overwhelm me as I heard footsteps crunching through the snow, getting closer. I looked back and saw a dark shape moving through the storm, coming straight for me. There was only one option left. I ran into the forest. The trees provided some shelter from the wind, but the snow was knee-deep and getting deeper. I stumbled through the darkness, branches clawing at my face, my lungs burning in the frigid air. Behind me, I could hear my pursuer crashing through the underbrush, following my trail. I don't know how long I ran. Time became meaningless in that white hell. My feet went numb, then my hands. The t-shirt and jeans I'd been wearing inside the warm lodge provided no protection against the Montana winter. I was going to die out here, either from exposure or from whatever that man planned to do with his knife. That's when I saw the lights. Through the trees ahead, I glimpsed the yellow glow of headlights moving along the road. A vehicle was coming up the mountain, probably a snowplow or a Forest Service truck checking the roads after the storm. I changed direction and pushed toward the lights, using the last of my strength to break through the tree line just as the truck rounded the bend. The driver was a Montana state trooper making his rounds. He found me collapsed in the middle of the road, hypothermic and babbling about an intruder. By the time we got back to the lodge with backup, the man was gone. They found evidence of the break-in, my keys still hanging where I'd left them, but no sign of the intruder. The investigation turned up nothing concrete. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. The working theory was that it had been a drifter, maybe someone who'd been using the empty lodge as shelter and was surprised by my arrival. The detective assured me that whoever it was had probably moved on, spooked by the police response. But I knew better. During those terrifying minutes in the forest, running for my life through the snow, I'd had time to think. The man had been watching the lodge for days before making his move. He'd studied the property, learned the layout, waited for the perfect opportunity. The storm hadn't been a coincidence. It had been his cover. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. Maybe I was just a random target, a middle-aged man alone in an isolated location. Maybe he'd been waiting for anyone to show up. or maybe he'd been waiting specifically for me. I never went back to that lodge. Barney sold the property 6 months later to a developer who turned it into a luxury resort. Sometimes I wonder if the new owners know about the man in the woods, the watcher who might still be out there, patient and methodical, waiting for his next opportunity. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all.